40 years. That is a very hard age for domestic cats to achieve. Some of the oldest cats out there, including Garfielf, who has its own Wikipedia page, died aged 38. But there is one currently living and lively cat, aged 40. He might eventually outlive us all. And that's because he is a fictional character. And yet, after 40 years of published comic strips, which are still going out every single day, Garfield is still alive. Not only is the strip running to this day, and is still, in my humble opinion, funny, it manages to do what it was conceived to do back in 1978. Provide people with a minute or so of good laugh. However, a piece of media is only alive as much as it inspires other creations. It is my humble opinion, but there are too many cases of works of art being much more lively in people's mind when other creators remember them and get inspiration. Inspiration comes in many shapes and forms. You may have inspiration to ridicule and parody, find flaws and make them evident. It might be affectionate kind of like when people find more goofs in movies which are well known and well loved, while there are most certainly lesser known contenders. It may be more serious, but still makes for pretty much the same effect, only longevity of media now looks like a decaying zombie. Inspiration might also enter creative ways. Looking at something while making something of your own is normal. It's not a plagiarism. I might even argue that plagiarism barely has anything to do with inspiration, even if it could definitely be salvaged by one. There are direct and less direct ways of how one thing could be inspired by plenty of others. It is probably a discussion for other day. After all, we are here to talk about a fat orange cat, although inspiration still has many things to do with that subject. So briefly, two more types that I wanted to elaborate about before the cat will have the curtain call. You may want to research the subject, write an essay or a book, or make a documentary, a video essay. That is what I'm probably and apparently doing right now. And there is also the fourth type, wild card. Everything aforementioned and yet nothing of it in a clear form. That is when people who made a piece of media might admit they were inspired by something, but might be only guessing why they did it themselves. Spontaneous, frantic, bright, precisely the kind of inspiration which brings to life internet memes. A common subject of the little video essay show named Quality Content. And in today's very special episode, which took longer to make than usual, we will talk about Garfield, Lasagna cat and Garfielf, and explain the immortality of a fat orange cat from the perspective of 4 decades. Our story begins in 1978 when cartoonist Jim Davis, then 33 years old, publishes a first comic strip of Garfield in several newspapers. It wasn't immediately the grandiose success, but when the newspaper Chicago Sun-Times dropped it, they've got complaints and were forced to reinstate. Forced by readers, who quickly got hooked, and some of them remain to this day. I'm going to draw my own comic strip to illustrate the two crucial and stable parts of Garfield's success. The first such part is that Garfield's humor is very relatable and domestic. It is derived from the everyday life, which is as simple as it is wise. Let's take a simple situation. Here is Uncle Vася. He's having his morning coffee, and he is very much tired and sleepy. His wife asks him, "Have you put the sugar into your coffee?" "Yeah, why?" he answers. "From a sugar bowl?" "Yeah, it's salt then." "Why is there salt in the sugar bowl?" asks the uncle, bewildered, and receives the answer that it is because he broke the salt shaker. Called a moron, He then concludes that his wife is much more salty than even his coffee, which now has several spoons. As you can notice, I have drawn traditional 3-panel comic strip, albeit with a twist. Each panel represents a decade in Garfield's history. 70s were simplistic, a bit experimental, and there were only 2 years to the 80s. The strip should have been ahead of its time to last, and it really was. It caught the reader off guard with how surreal their everyday life might seem if you put a borders of a simple square. If you took one scene from your day out of boring and tedious 24-hour marathon. Something simple. Something you might not notice, but after a few hours it will come up and put a smile on your face. That successful approach in just 2 years gave Garfield a very solid ground, which it used to the fullest in the 80s. It provided for calculated risks, and even after full 10 years for a whole, serious existential horror storyline, which haunts people to this day. It spawned massive amount of urban legends. Of course, it was just 1 week in a long decade of Garfield becoming a prosperous media juggernaut, transferring the success on television and most importantly into merchandise. 90s still had Garfield at his peak. The art crystallized and barely changed ever since. A whole art department started to work on the comic, delivering 365 strips a year with almost no repeating. But Jim Davis was still ahead of its time. He knew changes were coming, and his intuition suggested that newspapers will eventually decline as a media and succumb to what became Garfield's new hot platform in the late 90s and noughties, making him even more popular. Internet. People were eager to view comic strips there. Heck, they are as eager now, and Garfield remains popular to this day, despite anyone can publish a webcomic. Merchandise sales were probably even improved, because now you can sell it directly through the internet. The subject that Garfield, being as self-aware as it always was, handled itself quite a few times. And that's when people started to complain, just a bit. It gets boring. It becomes a part of everyday life, and then transcends it and becomes everyday life. Reminds you too much of your life and kind of tarnishes that sweet feeling of a minute of relief coming from a small comic book strip. A year before Garfield turned 30, it made someone inspired, itchy to do something about that feeling. Lasagna Cat arrived on YouTube on November the 8th, 2007, with a small announcement, a 0 episode, and then a whole season of content released on January 14th, 2008. It is hard for me to say something new about it because a small review channel named Nightmind already did a 38-minute spot-on analysis. And while I love this video, a link for which I'm giving in the description, I still have a few things on my own to say about this web series. I'm going to talk about how Lasagna Cat had two great aspects that made it a cult niche success, just like the original comic. Albeit it might or might not be the same two things that made the original comic popular. Garfield has its humor derived from the fact how surreal our everyday life is. Lasagna Cat takes the original strip and makes it into a two-segment parody/tribute. First segment is a scene-by-scene live-action adaptation of the comic strip done in such a way that it makes you question whether the humor holds up. The second part is a music video rendition, a remix. Set to some oddly unfitting, at times popular song, it turns concept upside down. It takes it away from the everyday surrealism and into a high orbit, into the world very similar to surreal memes, which only took off really in 2010s, the decade which was approached at the time. And it's far from the only thing in which Lasagna Cat was way ahead of its time. The distribution model of uploading a whole big season just as well took off in 2010s. It could be found, for example, on Netflix, which only entered content production in 2012, despite being founded in 1997. Among other series, it does so for their series based on Marvel Comics properties, set in Marvel Cinematic Universe. Most of the products in that universe contain one element, not crucial but a bit summarizing, a cameo by Stan Lee, a comic book writer who created most of the popular Marvel Comics characters. He is always creatively hidden in each MCU production, but in the Netflix shows, who he doesn't have time to film so often, only his photograph shows. And that is another thing Lasagna Cat predicted was an element presented in each and single episode, making a point out of ending them with a cameo of sorts by Jim Davis. One and only low-res photograph of him, seemingly found on Google in the middle of 2007 and stuck on creator's hard drive ever since. By the way, creators of the show, Zachary Johnson and Jeffrey Max, collectively known as Fatal Farm, are a major force to be reckoned with when it comes to very high-quality commercial and TV special production. However, this is their passion project. Another reflection on Jim Davis' statement that he wanted to create something popular, marketable, when he created Garfield. You want to prove that it is a passion project? What other kind might resurface almost 10 years later with a strong evidence suggesting that they never stopped working and were making a season all along to prove a point in the best possible way? Here I should step a bit out of my narration and say a thing as a fellow creator. I am making my first feature film for 10 years myself. Not here to plug it, especially since I have way more subtle ways to do it, and I already kinda did. What I want to say is that projects like that can drain you both financially and emotionally. Not only they haven't stopped. From episode 0 of season 2, they started the production of an epic finale, a nearly 5-hour art house movie, an exercise in repetition and building up to scenes that were even harder to produce than arguably an exhausting 4 hours parade of scenes filmed with an expensive motion tracking camera for majority of this episode. I know only one other show that did something similar. After at least 4 years of writing, Mark Frost and David Lynch, yet another duo of creators, resurrected their show Twin Peaks as an expensive, self-proclaimed 18-hour movie, which takes elements of the original, simpler 1990 show and creates an atomic bomb of an art house film out of it. But let's return to Lasagna Cat. It resurrected itself in 2010s, a bit of a different time. Their point about Garfield still stands, but there is a difference. They are not alone in the parodies of Garfield. As one man, with seemingly far less budget and dedication, managed to create a whole genre out of it in 2013, which is of course still alive as well. So, in 2013, a YouTube channel, Pilot Red Sun, dropped a bomb which still has a residual ringing. Garfielf. A natural result of a very simple typing error. It actually occurred to me at least twice, inadvertently. So what Garfielf is? It basically has a similar format to Lasagna Cat, that of a parody, with a major difference about it. It is made in MS Paint. It is barely animated. It is voiced with the cheap online services which provide crappy machine sounding voices. It overall sucks. But it does so intentionally on every deep and possible level. You see, you might not know it if you only know this video, but Pilot Red Sun is a professional musician and composer, and a very, very hard-working animator. In fact, if you listen to his debut album Achievement, which I genuinely can't recommend enough, you'll find the track suspiciously named Fat Cat. Your mileage may vary, but fans' consensus seems to be that it is the worst track on the album, as if specifically written to suck. And yet, it is not a song from Garfield. The music that you actually hear in the video is an avant-garde song Cock-n-Rolla by Begnagrad, a little-known Slovenian band which was active from 1975 to 1983. Older than Garfield, but less long-lived as well. So far, Garfield is Pilot Red Sun's only creation without original music, which leaves it, if largely still recognizable, as his work much less personal. I don't know for sure whether Fat Cat was written for Garfield and scrapped, or it was written later as a tribute, if not a commentary on Pilot Red Sun's big break. But what I know for sure is that Garfield had at least two factors that made it a success on some level. The first factor is that, while parodying everyday life from like nature, Garfield does it through a warped prism of perception roughly comparable to a person who just woke up, thanks to an alarm clock, which that person hates. It is as if Garfield himself gained limited ability to depict his life. Why things like that, so-called stylistic suck, rarely works properly is that unless you have a unique ability to enter that state consciously, replicating awful creations is very hard. It requires the exact kind of insight and inspiration I've mentioned in the beginning. The kind of inspiration which never knows what it makes and makes everything at once. You may perceive Garfield as a ridicule, a critique, a genuine creative effort. It's everything of that, and it has a great audit second vector. It looks as if anyone can make it. Neither professionally drawn comic strips, nor Lasagna Cat's sizzling video production makes you say, okay, that's cool, I can try it that very evening, or even right now. And here is the greatest thing about it. Depending on effort put into it, you may end up with a better result than original video, and more importantly, it's much likely that instead of unique flaws of Pilot Red Sun, there will be yours all over the video. And as you would glare upon your creation, which even now, after 5 years past, still guarantees you some level of attention, you may end up asking yourself, what should I do with that newfound choice? Creative choice. Pilot Red Sun just continued doing whatever he likes. Fatal Farm did as well, albeit with commercial work thrown in for a good measure to compensate for financial toll the production took. Jim Davis managed to smuggle a small existential piece, and masterpiece to boot, in the middle of longest running comic strip, and then just continued with his life, never stopping to work on Garfield, but stepping back just a bit. But all of them drove hundreds, maybe thousands creators to a point of what should I do next? And they did a lot of great things to non-creators as well, because all three connected creations have that reassuring quality about them. It works very differently, but it works. And, as it works, Garfield will live. It will live as an inspiration behind great creations, sometimes as inspiration behind the inspiration. Inspiration might not be immortal, but comparing to human life, it sure seems like the only lasting effect it might leave. Whatever we do creatively, or even not so creatively, might inspire someone. You might be a waiter and continue to live as a character in the book your weird client writes in his notebook each time he sits at your server. You might be an interesting human being whose ideas will be retooled for centuries. Or you might be a cat. and live way past your biological maximum by inspiring your human companion to create another cat. Each of us is someone's Garfield. That way, and each of us is a bit immortal. Happy birthday, cat, and congratulations on your cartoon. Now where would my pipe be?